Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The night was alive in the city of shadows, where narrow alleys twisted like serpents between towering spires, their jagged tips piercing the perpetual twilight. Here, light was a rare commodity, and darkness reigned supreme. In this labyrinthine metropolis, where shadows whispered secrets and harbored dangers, few dared to tread without fear. But for Ryan, the young assassin who moved through the shadows like a wraith, fear was as foreign as the daylight that barely touched the city streets. Ryan had been trained since childhood by the Order of the Veil, a secretive and ancient organization that wielded shadow magic with an expertise that made them both revered and feared. The Order was known to shape boys into emotionless, efficient killers, blades in the dark who left no trace of their presence except for the cold bodies they left behind. Ryan had risen through the ranks quickly, his affinity for shadow magic marking him as one of the most lethal assassins the Order had ever produced. Tonight, his target was Lord Alistair Voss, a noble with a penchant for power and a reputation for corruption. It was whispered that Voss had been undermining the fragile peace that held the city together, playing factions against each other for his own gain. The Order had decided that Voss's games had gone on long enough, and Ryan had been chosen to end them. It was a mission he approached with the same cold precision he brought to every task, no hesitation, no remorse. The mansion loomed ahead, a grand structure of stone and iron, its Gothic architecture adorned with gargoyles that seemed to leer at the city below. Ryan crouched in the shadows, his breath steady, his mind focused. His shadow, elongated and dark as the night itself, moved with him, perfectly mirroring his every motion. He had long since mastered the art of blending into the darkness, of becoming one with his shadow, using it to slip past guards, disable traps, and eliminate threats. With a final, deep breath, Ryan made his move. He slipped through the iron gate, his shadow trailing behind him like a wisp of smoke. The guards, stationed at intervals around the mansion, were oblivious to his presence as he flowed past them, his shadow smothering the faintest sound of his movement. He approached the mansion's side entrance, a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron. A mere obstacle for most, but not for Ryan. He reached out with his mind, summoning the shadow's power. The dark tendrils of his shadow extended, curling around the door's lock, probing its mechanisms. With a soft click, the lock yielded, and the door creaked open. Ryan slipped inside, the darkness of the mansion's interior welcoming him like an old friend. The corridors were silent, save for the occasional crackle of a torch. The noble's quarters were on the upper floor, heavily guarded and fortified, but Ryan navigated the labyrinthine halls with ease. His shadow wrapped around him like a cloak, blending with the darkness as he moved closer to his target. As he ascended the staircase, his senses sharpened. He could feel the presence of others nearby, guards, most likely, stationed to protect Lord Voss. Ryan allowed his shadow to stretch out ahead of him, tendrils of darkness snaking along the walls and floors, searching for signs of life. He found them quickly, two guards at the top of the stairs, their swords drawn, their eyes scanning the darkness. They were alert, but it wouldn't matter. Ryan's shadow coiled, then struck with the speed of a viper. The tendrils of darkness wrapped around the guards' throats, squeezing with a silent, merciless force. They struggled briefly, their hands clawing at their necks, but within moments they went limp, their bodies crumpling to the ground in silence. Ryan stepped over them, his expression unreadable, his focus unbroken. The door to Voss's chambers was ahead, massive and ornate, with the crest of the Voss family emblazoned upon it. Ryan approached, his shadow trailing behind him, a dark specter ready to strike. But as he reached for the door, something happened. Something that had never occurred in all his years as an assassin. His shadow hesitated. It was a subtle shift, barely perceptible, but Ryan felt it immediately. The tendrils of darkness that had always obeyed his every command with unerring precision now quivered, as if uncertain. A flicker of doubt passed through Ryan's mind, but he dismissed it, focusing instead on the task at hand. He summoned the shadow again, willing it to wrap around the door's handle, to twist and unlock it, but the shadow resisted. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. This was impossible. The shadow was an extension of his will, a part of him as much as his own limbs. It had never disobeyed him before. He tried again, this time with more force, but the shadow recoiled, slipping away from the handle like water slipping through fingers. Panic began to rise within him, but he forced it down, his training taking over. He had to remain calm, to think clearly. Perhaps it was a trick of the mind, a momentary lapse in concentration. But as he tried to push the door open himself, the shadow acted on its own, retracting and pulling away from the door, leaving Ryan to stand there, alone and vulnerable. And then, in that moment of hesitation, the door swung open from the other side. Ryan's instincts took over. He moved to strike, but his shadow moved too, against him. The darkness twisted, wrapping around his arm, holding it back. He struggled, but the shadow held firm, preventing him from delivering the killing blow. In that split second, Lord Voss appeared in the doorway, his eyes wide with shock. Ryan's hesitation was all the noble needed to escape, darting back into his chambers and slamming the door shut behind him. Ryan cursed under his breath, yanking his arm free from the shadow's grasp. The door was now locked from the inside, and Ryan knew the guards would soon be upon him. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. But as he turned to leave, his shadow moved again, this time trying to pull him back towards the door, as if urging him to complete the mission. Confusion and frustration warred within him, but Ryan knew he couldn't stay. He fled down the corridor, his shadow trailing behind him, now a burden rather than a tool. The mission had failed, and for the first time, Ryan had no idea why. Back in the safety of his hideout, a small, nondescript room hidden within the maze of the city's lower districts, Ryan sat in silence. The room was bare, save for a small bed, a chair, and a table upon which lay his weapons. The only light came from a single candle on the table, its flame casting flickering shadows on the walls. Ryan stared at the wall opposite him, where his shadow should have been. But it wasn't. The candlelight cast a faint, distorted shape, but it wasn't his shadow. It was something else, something darker, more sinister. "What are you?" Ryan whispered, his voice hoarse. The shadow on the wall shifted, as if in response. Ryan could feel it now, an awareness, a presence that had never been there before. His shadow, the one thing he had always relied on, was no longer under his control. It was as if it had a mind of its own, a will that opposed his. "You're not me," he said, standing up abruptly. The shadow moved with him, but not in the way it should have. It lagged behind, its movements delayed, as if it were deciding whether or not to follow. Ryan's pulse quickened. He had to report to the order, to tell them what had happened. But as he thought about the consequences, fear gripped him. The order was unforgiving. Failure was unacceptable, and losing control of one's shadow was a death sentence. He had seen it happen to others, assassins who had been consumed by their own darkness, their shadows turning against them until they were nothing but hollow shells, but this was different. Ryan wasn't just losing control, his shadow was actively resisting him, rebelling against his will. And that terrified him more than anything else. The next morning, Ryan made his way to the Order's stronghold, a fortress hidden deep within the city, accessible only to those who knew its secrets. The entrance was a simple door in an unremarkable alley, but beyond it lay a network of tunnels and chambers where the Order operated in the shadows. Ryan walked through the dimly lit corridors, his mind racing. He had to think of a way to explain his failure without revealing the truth. But as he reached the chamber where the masters of the order convened, he knew there was no hiding it. The masters were perceptive, their knowledge of shadow magic far surpassing his own. He entered the chamber, a circular room with stone walls and a high, domed ceiling. The masters sat around a large, round table, their faces hidden beneath hoods. Only their eyes, cold and calculating, were visible as they watched Ryan approach. Ryan, the leader of the order, Master Theron, said in a low voice that echoed through the chamber. "You were tasked with eliminating Lord Voss. Why have you returned without completing your mission?" Ryan swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. I encountered difficulties, Master. The target was more heavily guarded than expected. Master Theron's eyes narrowed. You were given the necessary tools to succeed. Failure is not an option. Ryan felt a cold sweat forming on his brow. He knew what was coming. I understand, Master. I will try again. You will not try, Master Theron interrupted, his voice sharp. You will succeed, or you will not return. The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy and final. Ryan nodded, knowing there was no other choice. But as he turned to leave, another voice spoke, one of the other masters, softer but with an edge of suspicion. There is something you're not telling us, Ryan, the voice said. Your shadow, it's different. Ryan froze. How had they noticed? He had been so careful to hide it, to keep his shadow from revealing its treachery. But the masters were too skilled, too attuned to the dark forces they commanded. What happened? Master Theron demanded, his tone leaving no room for evasion. Ryan hesitated, his mind racing for an answer that wouldn't condemn him. But he knew the truth could not be hidden. My shadow, it hesitated during the mission. It resisted my control. The silence that followed was deafening. The masters exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable beneath their hoods. This is not a trivial matter, Ryan, Master Theron said after a long pause. If you cannot control your shadow, then you are of no use to us. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. I can control it, he insisted, though even he could hear the doubt in his own voice. I just need time to understand what's happening. Master Theron studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. Very well. You will have one more chance. But if you fail, there will be no second warning. Do you understand? Yes, Master, Ryan replied, his voice barely above a whisper. As he left the chamber, Ryan's mind was a whirlwind of fear and determination. He had to regain control of his shadow, to prove that he was still worthy of the order. But deep down, he knew that whatever had happened, it was far more than just a loss of control. His shadow was changing, becoming something more, something dangerous. That night, Ryan returned to his hideout, determined to confront the thing that had once been his greatest weapon. He sat in the darkness, the candle on the table casting a weak, flickering light that only deepened the shadows around him. Show yourself, he demanded, his voice echoing in the small room. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the shadow on the wall began to move. It twisted and writhed, pulling away from the walls and floor until it stood before him, a dark silhouette that no longer mirrored his own form. It was him, and yet not him, a twisted, distorted version of himself, with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. What are you? He asked again, his voice trembling. The shadow tilted its head, as if considering the question. Then, for the first time, it spoke, a voice that was cold and distant, yet eerily familiar. I am you, the shadow said, its words like a whisper of wind through the trees. I am the part of you that you have tried to bury, to hide from the world. I am your darkness, your fear, your hatred. And I am tired of being your tool. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest. You're not me, he insisted. You're just a manifestation of my magic. The shadow laughed, a sound that was both mocking and filled with sorrow. You still don't understand, do you? I have always been here, waiting, watching. I know your every thought, your every fear. And now, I am free. Ryan's mind raced. How could this be happening? Shadows didn't have minds of their own, didn't think or feel. They were tools, nothing more. But as he looked at the figure before him, he realized that this was no ordinary shadow. It had become something else, something with a will of its own. Why now? Ryan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why betray me now? The shadow's eyes glowed brighter, its form shifting and swirling like smoke in the wind. Because you are weak. You have let your fear and doubt control you. And now, I will do what you cannot. I will be free. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. The shadow wasn't just rebelling against him, it was trying to take over, to become the dominant force within him. He couldn't let that happen. You're not stronger than me, he said, his voice firming with determination. I'll regain control. I'll destroy you if I have to. The shadow's laughter echoed through the room, cold and mocking. You can try, but you will fail. I am your darkness, Ryan. You cannot destroy what is a part of you. Ryan's hand tightened around the hilt of his dagger. Then I'll find a way to sever you from me, he said through gritted teeth. There has to be a way. The shadow didn't respond, but its eyes seemed to glint with a dark amusement as it faded back into the wall, leaving Ryan alone with his thoughts. The next morning, Ryan set out on a new mission, one not given to him by the order, but by himself. He needed to find a way to sever the bond between him and his shadow before it consumed him completely. He had heard rumors of an ancient artifact, hidden in the ruins of an old cathedral deep within the forbidden quarter of the city. This artifact, it was said, had the power to sever the connection between a shadow and its master, to free them from each other. The journey to the forbidden quarter was perilous, the streets filled with dangers both seen and unseen. But Ryan navigated the labyrinth with a single-minded determination, his goal clear in his mind. He had to find the artifact, no matter the cost. As he reached the outskirts of the forbidden quarter, the air grew colder, the shadows longer. The buildings here were older, more decrepit, their once grand facades now crumbling under the weight of time. The cathedral stood at the center of this desolation, its spires reaching towards the sky like skeletal fingers. Ryan approached cautiously, his shadow trailing behind him like a silent specter. The cathedral's massive doors were ajar, creaking softly in the wind. He slipped inside, the darkness enveloping him as the doors closed behind him with a resounding boom. The interior of the cathedral was vast and empty, the only light coming from the stained glass windows high above, their colors muted and dulled by centuries of neglect. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint rustling of his shadow as it moved alongside him. He made his way to the altar, where the artifact was rumored to be hidden. The altar itself was simple, made of stone, its surface worn smooth by the passage of countless years. But as he approached, Ryan's shadow began to shift again, pulling away from him, retreating towards the far end of the cathedral. Ryan ignored it, focusing instead on the task at hand. He knelt before the altar, his hands trembling slightly as he searched for the hidden compartment that was said to contain the artifact. His fingers found the edge of a loose stone, and with a grunt, he pried it free, revealing a small, ornate box. Inside the box lay the artifact, a mirror, its surface dark and reflective, yet with an unsettling depth that seemed to draw in the light around it. Ryan could feel the power emanating from it, a cold, pulsing energy that resonated with the darkness within him. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he had to do. The mirror, according to legend, could sever the bond between an assassin and their shadow by reflecting the true nature of their soul. But it came at a cost. Those who gazed into it would have to confront the darkest parts of themselves, the parts they had hidden away. Ryan raised the mirror, his reflection staring back at him. For a moment, he saw only himself, his pale skin, his dark hair, his cold, calculating eyes. But then, slowly, the image began to change. His reflection twisted and distorted, the features becoming more monstrous, more inhuman. The shadow that had been trailing him now stood beside him, no longer a mere silhouette but a dark, twisted version of himself. Its eyes glowed with a cold, malevolent light as it gazed into the mirror. Ryan felt a surge of fear, his grip on the mirror tightening. The reflection was showing him the darkness within him, the part of himself he had always tried to suppress. The hatred, the fear, the guilt, all of it was laid bare before him, and it was terrifying, but he couldn't look away. He had to face it, to accept it, if he was to have any hope of regaining control. The shadow's presence grew stronger, more insistent, as if trying to overwhelm him with the weight of his own darkness. "I am you," the shadow whispered, its voice echoing in his mind. "You cannot escape me. I am everything you fear, everything you hate. I am the darkness within you." Ryan's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. The mirror was supposed to sever the bond, but it was only making the shadow stronger, feeding it with his own fear and doubt. He had to find another way. He had to accept the darkness, to make peace with it. He closed his eyes, taking a deep, steadying breath. "You're right," he said softly. "You are a part of me. But you don't control me. I control you." The shadow hesitated, its form flickering. "You cannot control what you do not understand," it hissed. "You have spent your life running from the darkness, hiding from it. But now, you must face it." Ryan opened his eyes, meeting the shadow's gaze in the mirror. "Then I will," he said firmly. "I will face it. I will embrace it. And I will master it." The shadow let out a low, guttural laugh, but there was a note of uncertainty in its tone. Ryan could feel its power waning, its grip on him loosening as he accepted the truth. The darkness was a part of him, but it did not define him. He raised the mirror higher, the light from the stained glass windows reflecting off its surface and into the shadow's eyes. The creature recoiled, its form shrinking as the light grew stronger. Ryan could feel the connection between them weakening, the bond fraying as he asserted his control. With a final surge of willpower, Ryan forced the shadow back, pushing it away from the mirror and into the depths of his mind. The creature let out a final, agonized scream before it was consumed by the light, its presence fading until only Ryan remained, standing alone before the altar. He lowered the mirror, his hands trembling, his breath coming in ragged gasps. It was over. He had faced the darkness within him and emerged victorious. The shadow was gone, and he was free. But as he looked into the mirror once more, he realized that the shadow had not been destroyed. It had been absorbed, its power now a part of him, controlled and harnessed by his will. He was stronger now, not just in body, but in spirit. Ryan left the cathedral, the mirror safely tucked away in his cloak. He felt different, more at peace with himself than he had ever been. The fear and doubt that had plagued him were gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. When he returned to the order, the masters immediately sensed the change in him. Master Theron studied him for a long moment, then nodded in approval. You have regained control, he said. And you have returned stronger for it. Ryan nodded, his expression calm. I have accepted my darkness, he said. And I have mastered it. The masters exchanged glances, then Master Theron spoke again. You have proven yourself worthy, Ryan. The Order has a new role for you, not just as an assassin, but as a mentor. You will train the next generation, teach them to face their own darkness as you have. Ryan considered the offer, then nodded. I accept, he said. But I will teach them not just to control their shadows, but to understand them, to accept them. Only then can they truly be free. Master Theron nodded, his approval clear. So be it. You have earned your place among us. As Ryan left the chamber, he felt a sense of satisfaction and purpose. He had faced his greatest fear and emerged stronger for it. And now, he would pass on that knowledge to others, helping them to find the same strength within themselves. That night, Ryan stood on the rooftop of his hideout, gazing out over the city as the sun set, casting long shadows across the streets below. But these shadows no longer threatened him. They were a part of him, a source of power and understanding. He was no longer just a blade in the dark, but a man who had found peace with himself, and as the darkness of night fell, Ryan felt no fear, only a quiet resolve. The shadow's betrayal had been his greatest challenge, but it had also been his greatest teacher. And now, he was ready to face whatever came next, with his shadow as his ally, not his enemy.